So it's a pleasure to welcome you all today to the symposium, The Chorus, Saidiya v. Hartman's Trilogy and the Black Feminist Tradition. My name is Mika Makalani, and I'm the director of the Center for Africana Studies, which is co-sponsoring this event with my wonderful colleague, Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson, and the Diaspora Solidarities Lab. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the generous support of this event from the Departments of History and English, and the logistical support that several people have provided. Most notably, Rachel Labozetta, who is a staff member in the history department, who handled all the logistical arrangements, such as travel, the spread in the back, the lunch that we will have, and a host of other things, some that I'm probably not even aware of. And I'm going to probably mispronounce this name, so I apologize. Shaharyar Imran, who I've been told to refer to as Sherry. He is a graduate student in the program in Race, Immigration, and Citizenship, and he designed the flyers for the symposium. Dr. Shantae Stocks, who is with Inheritance Baltimore, who offered help with planning, and her undergraduate work study students in IB, Antif Guy and Stella Huo, who helped spread, post up posters around campus, and the work of graduate students in the history department who have helped with publicity and who are helping with the logistics today. Ellie Palazzolo, Jay Bishop, and Jessica Newby. And I apologize if I've mispronounced anyone's name or if I've missed anyone, but I assure you that your time and energy are greatly appreciated. And so I just want to say a little bit about kind of what brings us here to today. And I think we are all aware that this is the 25th anniversary of the publication of Scenes of Subjection. And just in terms of when I first came into contact, or when I first encountered Scenes of Subjection, it was my last semester of my master's program, and unfortunately I can't hide that date, so this is 1998. Thankfully I'm not that old. I don't know why the professor assigned it, but I remember just being utterly engrossed by the text. And part of it, I think, was that the previous summer I had been with some writers, and there was an interview of Toni Morrison that had been circulating. Now, I can't remember who the interview was with, what year, and I had seen it once before. Another friend who was a writer had loaned me her VHS, so this tells you how long ago it was. The only thing I remember about that interview was that the interviewer asked Toni Morrison, isn't Setha larger than life, Setha from Beloved? And St. Morrison, in her gentle but rebuking way, responded and let him know how thoughtless the question was, that something like, I always thought Setha was as large as life. And I don't recall anything else from the interview but that particular response. And it left me at the time, and it still stays with me, a set of questions that have not really been answered, and I think have only been approached, but it led me to contemplate how one writes large as life. And at the time, I still wanted to become a historian, and so I began to think about how does one write a history that is as large as life. What exactly did Morrison mean? What was it life that Baby Suggs was imploring us to love in her sermon in the clearing? These were, to be sure, jumbo questions that I went into coursework with, and that also occupied me as people were beginning to organize for the convening of the Black Radical Congress in Chicago in that summer of 1998. And so in some ways, those questions might have receded from my mind until that last semester when I read Scenes of Subjection. And having those questions and organizing and being involved in the organizing of a movement at that time, I began to realize what a work of scholarship might look like that was written as large as life. Scenes of Subjection was a work as grand in its sweep and compelling in its insights that called on us to rethink the nature of freedom and what it means to pursue democratic inclusion when that democracy, as Keeanga-Yamileth Taylor puts it in her foreword to the 25th anniversary edition, quote, came into being through slavery, genocide, rape, dispossession, murder, and terror. Indeed, I think the impact of Scenes of Subjection and the importance of Hartman's work lies in her ability to delve into these questions and write in a way that is as large as life, all the while with an attention to understanding that what constitutes life is often the most important question. And this is where I would offer the work holds its greatest importance. For Hartman is not simply preoccupied with how our thirst for life was beat down, but with what we might do with life in creating a life in a Western humanistic order. And so I just want to read one really compelling quote to her preface to the 25th anniversary edition. The enslaved refused to accept the order of values that had transformed them into units of currency and capital, beasts and crops, breeders, incubators, lactating machines, and sentient tools. At secret meetings and freedom schools, hidden in loopholes of retreat and hush harbors, gathered at the river or dwelling in the swamp, the enslaved articulated a vision of freedom that far exceeded that of the liberal imagination. An expansive register of minor gestures, ways of sustaining and creating life, caring for one another, undoing slavery by small acts of stealth and destruction, communal dreaming, sacred transport, acts of redress, and faith in the power of in a power greater than master and nation made it possible to survive the unbearable while never acceding to it. The arrangement of stars in the night sky, the murmur and echo of songs traveling across a river, the revered objects buried near a prayer tree, the rumors of fugitives in the swamp or maroons in the hills, nourish dreams of a free territory, or an existence without masters, or a plot against the plantation, or reveries of miraculous deliverance. So we can see, even in reflecting a quarter century after its publication, with all the work that has come in between, Hartman still answering the charge that Morrison outlined for us to think as large as life. Now, the particulars of today's event came into view over the summer. I had the fortune of attending a writing retreat with Mabula Sumahoro, who was discussing the challenges that she confronts in translating Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother into French, and thinking about what it means to translate into a language which is the language that she works in, the language she's most familiar with, but that isn't her mother language, or isn't her mother tongue, as she puts it. And for those of you who attended Dr. Sumahoro's book discussion yesterday can imagine, it was an utterly enthralling conversation. I think everybody at the retreat can attest to that, and actually Jessica Newby was there and probably can give an equally compelling account of that conversation. And it's one of those things to know that someone is brilliant and to read their work and see their brilliance, but then to see them do it in such an effortless way. And so I began to think in that conversation, wow, Mabula's gonna be in New York for the year, Saidiya Hartman's in New York. It'd be great if we could get them to Hopkins to have a conversation. But I also knew the Center for Africana Studies didn't have any staff. And so I didn't see how I could pull anything off this year. But having a conversation with my colleague, Dr. Johnson, she mentioned that she was bringing Dr. Sumahoro down to discuss her book. And I thought, okay, this might be the possibility. And so from that conversation, it grew into the larger structure of the symposium. And then the most challenging part, approaching Dr. Hartman and asking if she had any time to come down to Hopkins to do this. And almost as soon as I hit send, I got a reply, enthusiastically, yes, let's work out a date. And so I want to thank Dr. Hartman for agreeing to come down on relatively short notice as these things go, as well as Dr. Mabula for her willingness to extend her stay and participate in that conversation later this afternoon. So I want to thank my colleague, Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson, for her help in pulling us together and for her work, which at a certain point became far more than I'm sure she bargained for, because I just did not have the ability to stretch myself in any other direction. So I appreciate your work on this and the labor you've done, and I will now turn it over to Dr. Johnson, who is my colleague and associate professor in the Department of History, as well as a faculty affiliate in the Center for Africana Studies. She is co-director of the Diaspora Solidarities Lab and the author of the award-winning book, Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World.
Thank you all so much, and I'm actually going to ask Jessica Newby to come up and join us because she's going to offer an introduction of our first set of panelists. Hello, everybody. Thank everybody for your patience in the room and in the Zoom room. My remarks are going to be really short, just to welcome and just a little bit about why we named this event the Chorus. So there is a couple of lines in Wayward Lives. The chorus is a refrain across Hartman's work, and I'm hoping that is something that we talk about today in this morning conversation. But there are a few lines nearing the end of Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, that I just kind of want to read that are part of a section called The Chorus Increases. To fall in step with the chorus is to do more than shake your ass and hum the melody, or repeat the few lines of the bit part handed over like a gift from the historian, as if to say, see, the girl can speak. Or to be grateful that the sociologist has taken a second look and recognizes the working out of revolutionary ideals in an ordinary Black woman's life. Guessing at the world and seizing at chance, she eludes the law and transforms the terms of the possible. So the chorus is, broadly appears across all kinds of humanistic work. It's the Greek chorus, providing commentary, also an implacable wall of assent or dissent. It's the chorus that curates the experience of the audience/user, and in this we could even think of, is Black Twitter maybe a chorus or a chorus line? It's the chorus line of dancers, the show behind the headliner. And the chorus is also a way of thinking about, for me, Black femme formation, Black femme ecstatic, erotic possibility, and heartbreak. And so this is an opportunity to think about what the chorus and the refrain has been in Hartman's work, but also in the Black feminist tradition broadly, and an opportunity for so many of us who have been recipients of the gift of this work to come together and just have a really great day and great conversation. So I'm going to leave it there and step back for Jessica Newby.
Good morning. My name is Jessica Newby. I'm a second-year graduate student in the history department at Johns Hopkins University. I'm here to do introductions for our panelists this morning. First, we have Dr. Derrais Carter, who is assistant professor of gender and women's studies at the University of Arizona, where he researches Black critical theory, Black queer studies, and Black popular culture, narrative theory, and cultural history. A Fulbright scholar, he is the co-editor of The Iconic Obama, Essays on Media Representations of the Candidate and New President, and of Black Revelry, in honor of The Sugar Shack, a book album built around Ernie Barnes' painting The Sugar Shack, a collaboration with writers, visual artists, dancers, and a DJ. Black Revelry is a celebration of an iconic painting's various renderings of Black social life and intimacy. It was also the basis for the Black Revelry Quiet Storm, a 3-part radio show which aired in Los Angeles, Berlin, and Amsterdam from December 2020 through February 2021, of which Dr. Carter was the late-night DJ, exploring different modes of storytelling for reading, celebrating, and enacting Black intimacy and mapping Black social life. Dr. Carter is the author of 2 forthcoming books, the first entitled Marvin Gaye's I Want You, for Bloomsbury's 33rd and a 3rd series, a Black queer engagement with Gaye's iconic album, using interviews, visual art, poetry, criticism, and gossip. Also forthcoming is Obscene Material, Black Girls, A Aesthetic Refusal, and The Moens Affair from University of North Carolina Press, a Black feminist narration, an anti-recovery project, building upon methods by Christina Sharp and Dr. Saidiya Hartman to retell the story of a 1919 obscenity attack upon Black girls living in Washington, D.C., while also providing visual and ethical strategies for circumventing the narration of gratuitous anti-Black violence. Next, we have Dr. Marisa Fuentes, Associate Professor of History and Women's and Gender Study at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, where she researches and teaches courses bringing together critical historiography, historical geography, and Black feminist theory to examine gender, sexuality, and slavery in the early modern Atlantic world. She is the author of Dispossessed Lives, Enslaved Women, Violence in the Archive, from University of Pennsylvania Press, winner of the Barbara T. Christensen Best Humanities Book Prize, the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Book Prize, and the Berkshire's Conference of Women's Historians First Book Prize. She's also the co-editor of Scarlet and Black, Slavery and Dispossession in Rutgers History, and the Slavery and the Archive Special Issue in History of the Present. Dr. Fuentes has written a number of articles, book chapters, and book reviews, including Power and Historical Figuring, Rachel Pringle Polgreen's Troubled Archive, which won the Andre Ramos Mate Neville Hall Article Prize, and has also contributed to the Dictionary of Caribbean and Afro-Latin American Biography, Enslaved Women in Encyclopedia, and the Encyclopedia of Frederick Douglass. Her work has been supported by the Fulbright Program, the Ford Foundation, the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University, and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Next, we have Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson, Associate Professor of History at the Johns Hopkins University, where she researches Atlantic slavery and the Atlantic African diaspora. Dr. Johnson is the author of Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy and Freedom in the Atlantic World from the University of Pennsylvania Press, the winner of the 2020 Kemper and Layla Williams Prize for Louisiana History, the 2021 Wesley Logan Best Book in African Diaspora History Prize from the Association of American Historians, the 2021 Laura Romero First Book Publication Prize of the American Studies Association, the Rebel Women Lit Caribbean Readers Award. Wicked Flesh was also a finalist for the 2021 Frederick Douglass Prize from the Gilder Lehman Institute for the Study of American History, an honorable mention for the 2021 Barbara Christian Literary Prize from the Caribbean Studies Association, and an honorable mention from the 2021 Mary Alice and Philip Bocher Book Prize from the French Colonial History Society. It was named a Best Black History Book of 2020 by Black Perspectives, the publication of the African American Intellectual History Society. Dr. Johnson is also co-editor with Lauren Tilton and David Mimno of Debates in the Digital Humanities, Computational Humanities. She is guest editor of Slavery and the Machine, a special issue of Archipelago's Journal, and co-editor with Dr. Mark Anthony Leal of Black Code, a special issue of the Black Scholar. An internationally recognized digital humanist, Dr. Johnson is the director of Life Code, Digital Humanities Against Enclosure, and senior research associate with the Center for the Digital Humanities at Johns Hopkins University. She is the co-director and co-principal investigator of the Diaspora Solidarities Lab, alongside Dr. Yomira Figueroa Vasquez, associate professor of global Afro-Diaspora Studies in the Department of English at Michigan State University. Diaspora Solidarities Lab is a multi-institutional Black feminist partnership that supports solidarity work in Black and ethnic studies conducted by undergraduates, graduate students, faculty members, and community partners who are committed to transformative justice and accountable to communities beyond the Western Academy. Next, we have Dr. Asma Naeem, who is the interim co-director, and the Eddie C. and C. Sylvia Brown Chief Curator at the Baltimore Museum of Art. She holds a BA in Art History and Political Science from Johns Hopkins University and a PhD in Art History from the University of Maryland. And her research focuses on issues of power, identity, and technology, and range from the 18th century to the present. Prior to the Baltimore Museum of Art, she held curatorial positions at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, where she presented, among other shows, an early career retrospective of the work of Titus Kaphar, and an historical and contemporary exploration of the silhouette through the lens of gender, race, and technology. She has written widely on American art, contemporary art, critical race theory, the South Asian diaspora, and museum studies. Her book, Out of Earshot, Sound, Technology, and Power in American Art from 1847 to 1897, was published by University of California Press in 2020. While at the Baltimore Museum of Art, Dr. Naeem has organized exhibitions on the work of such artists such as Candace Braitz, Isaac Julian, and Valerie Maynard. Her exhibition, Salmon Tour, No Ordinary Love, is on view at the Baltimore Museum of Art now through October, so is it? No? When it will travel to 3 additional museum venues across the country. Dr. Naeem has delivered lectures in many distinguished venues, such as the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, Columbia University, Yale University, the American Studies Association, and the College Art Association. She has taught modern European and American art history courses at Catholic University and the University of Maryland, and has published articles in American Quarterly, American Art, and the Chicago Art Journal. She's currently organizing a sweeping social and art history of the hip-hop movement, both as an American and global phenomenon, and a transatlantic multi-generational exploration of the partition of British India in terms of trauma, dignity, and futurity. So welcome again to all of our panelists. Thank you.
I'm thinking I'm up first, right, Jessica? Yes, okay. I want to begin by thanking Minka and Jessica for this, putting this symposium together and all the support and sponsorship that went into its production. It was really difficult to write these comments because with these forums on Saidiya's work, I really enjoy being silent in the background, helping to organize and curate conversations about its broad and enduring influence across fields. So I've done my best to offer brief reflections on the impact of scenes on my intellectual development, what her mentorship has meant to me, and my academic journey, and the challenges such work can conjure in the profession. So thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you this morning. I am a student of Saidiya Hartman. This by now is obvious. I am also a student of Scenes of Subjection, of Lose Your Mother, of Venus in Two Acts, and Wayward Lives. But Scenes was the formative text. This book in hand, with Trouillot's Silencing the Past, shifted my intellectual world in the beginning of graduate school about the practice of history and about the violences of slavery, legal, diffuse, indiscernible, discursive, and explicit. Scenes forced me to be rigorously suspicious of orderly and progressive narratives of slavery and freedom in the historiography of slavery. It showed us how the notions of Black humanity and Black subjectivity enabled and enacted particular kinds of punishment, criminalization, and terror on captive people. Scenes taught me to understand that our empathy for the horrendous injustices enslaved people endured and succumbed to, and my and others' desire for the enslaved to survive and to subvert the terrors of slavery, displaced their denied pain for my own, a self-centering. Scenes modeled for me the ethics of refusal, of uncritically reproducing violence, of narrative coherence, of archival power, of not standing down in the midst of challenging structures and disciplines and people who say, this is not history. Scenes taught me to interrogate terms and concepts, agency, resistance, consent, that when placed in the context of slavery's domination and against liberal humanism as a measure of possibility, fail to account for the enslaved condition. But for me, Scenes is inseparable from Saidiya, the person and her model of intellectual rigor and mentorship. Preparing these brief remarks, I recalled my first and only class with her, how I struggled to understand one single word of the discussion and how I announced this. And when on the eve of my qualifying exams, a 3-hour oral interrogation, Saidiya asked me a practice question and my mind went completely blank. I could not remember or say anything. Despite these moments of fumbling, she somehow kept me as a student and persisted in pushing me to envision a place for myself in this academic world. For this, I owe her a deep debt of gratitude. As an overwhelmed, tenured professor with no time to spare, I am struck by the time Saidiya and I had together, time she volunteered or initiated at a cafe or in Sproul Plaza, where she had given me something incredibly hard to read, Gayatri Spivak's Chemist Subaltern Speak, or historian Ranajit Guha's Chandra's Death, asking me what I thought, how I might employ their methods and care in my work on gender and Caribbean slavery, to take in their attention to political subjectivity and the relentless silencing of the subaltern by archival and colonial power. These readings demonstrated an ethics of responsibility to historical subjects that I would keenly engage as I began the research and writing of my dissertation and first book. At the time, I was surprised and unbelieving that she wanted to know what I thought. This unbelieving lasted way too long, and I am certain it tried her patience. It was Saidiya who set the bar for me as I set out to write my dissertation in Dispossessed Lives, a bar at first I doubted was reachable. I offer these reflections to pay tribute to her gifts of unceasing support, guidance, and standards of excellence that continue on these past 25 years, and to stress how much this care has sustained me through the loneliness and fear of going against the politics and rules of a discipline and field. As we gather here to celebrate the longevity and profundity of this book and her work, I would be remiss not to comment on the idea that the legibility and traction of scenes, particularly in the field of history, was inevitable. In not attending to this, we would miss the risk it took to write this book and to follow her theoretical leads. When I left graduate school 10 years after Scenes was published and left my intellectual home of African-American studies, I quickly learned that the field of history wasn't reckoning with this book. Indeed, many historians of slavery either refused to engage it, she's not a historian, they said, or worse, borrowed her conceptual revelations without citation. What this meant for me, as integral as her work was to mine, was an uphill battle in a field still mired in empiricism and progressive teleological narratives. Prior to its publication, when I shared pieces of what would become Dispossessed Lives at various talks, I struggled to convince historians to stay with me through the violent and difficult terrain of urban Caribbean slavery and with non-traditional methods that I argued were necessary to work through specific ways enslaved women were constituted, violated, and silenced by the archive. After each talk, I would field questions and comments from members of the audience who expressed their concerns about attending to the emotional lives and worlds of the enslaved, or the cultural and cosmological survivals that would evidence enslaved perseverance. Within my home institution, I was encircled by doubt. I was told by colleagues that there was not enough evidence to write a whole book, and that I needed to add another island to broaden the N, or sample size. I was warned not to present enslaved people in such subjection. No one would want to read this, and that they couldn't wait for structuralism to return to the field. But what scared me the most, as my tenure depended upon the legibility and acceptance of my book, was being accused of writing fiction. This is the historian's sharpest dagger and most devastating accusation, even as it refuses to acknowledge the archive and historical narrative themselves are a kind of fiction. Fortunately, I also had the support of people who face similar pushback and who, despite the real possibility of tenure denial or loss of a job, insisted on rigorous path-breaking work that explored the complexities of Black lives, even if one's peers did not yet understand. Deborah Gray White told me to ignore the pushback because some of them were 20th century historians who could not appreciate the devastating silences of slavery's archive. Jennifer Morgan read everything and told me yes, and to keep going. But Saidiya's look of recognition, especially through many tears, was an incredible comfort. She told me to write the book I wanted to write, regardless of the consequences. She assured me I would land on my feet no matter what. She pushed me to take the risk because she had the incredible foresight that I did not. She had fought similar field battles. She also gave me permission, through her advice and scholarship, to explore my writing as a method, and to discover an argument through the process of critical fabulation. I don't want us to take for granted the path Saidiya created, the ground she broke, and the disciplinary barriers she knocked down, beginning with scenes, but continuing through her genre-defying and genius work in Wayward Lives. Scenes is core to our thinking about the archives of slavery, how we write about violence, our ethical scholarly practices, and necessary disciplinary interventions. The field of history can no longer deploy uninterrogated language and romantic fictions of slavery and ignore the dangers of freedom or the Black precarity in the afterlife of slavery. Scenes requires careful, slow, and studied reading. It must be reread in a moment when careful, slow, and studied reading is a relic of a time before the flurry and fast pace of social media's academic trends. Saidiya, thank you so much for this work and your Black feminist ethics and example. And thank all of you for sharing your time.
So, that is hard to follow up. I am speaking today on Lose Your Mother, which I have here, a journey along the Atlantic slave route. And I want to start with a quote from it from the very beginning, and we'll get to the end, which is actually my favorite part of the book is the last chapter. The most universal definition of the slave is a stranger. Torn from kin and community, exiled from one's country, dishonored and violated, the slave defines the position of the outsider. She is the perpetual outcast, the coerced migrant, the foreigner, the shame-faced child in the lineage. Contrary to popular belief, Africans did not sell their brothers and sisters into slavery. They sold strangers, those outside the web of kin and clan relationships, non-members of the polity, foreigners and barbarians at the outskirts of their country, and lawbreakers expelled from society. In order to betray your race, you had first to imagine yourself as one. The language of race developed in the modern period and in the context of the slave trade. One of the things that, the way that Lose Your Mother came into my hands, and I'm glad that Marisa is talking about the ways that scenes entered into her life and entered into the work that she does. This book entered my hands through the network and web of Black women scholars, a network that has expanded rapidly, not as rapidly perhaps as we would like, but rapidly enough. And as part of a longer genealogy that is still in some ways too recent. Scholar Aisha K. Finch passed me this book on the, as a reward and a celebration of passing my comprehensive exams. And when she gave it to me, at the time, I was more secretly, publicly, but more secretly than perhaps now, doing digital work on histories of slavery. I was blogging African Diaspora PhD, and another self of mine was blogging at Nunez's Daughter. And at that time, I wrote a reflection on the book because I was so deeply moved, which was a kind of transgression and an opening of myself to thinking of scholarly works in public. Not something that you really sort of did at the time, and Marisa sort of referencing sort of a slower time before social media. This was, in between the founding of Tumblr and Twitter. Like, it's really, those things seem iconic now, but they're really quite young. Or maybe I think of myself as young at that moment. So this is from my 2007 reflection on this text. Each step Hartman takes ripples with the past violence of slavery, race, and colonialism. And it is reminiscent of struggles with economic oppression, disfranchisement, violence, healthcare, and education that are happening across the African diaspora today. Each issue, each headline, and each cataclysmic event is replete with an unspoken history of slavery, racism, segregation, colonialism, and unfinished civil rights revolutions. These words, these reflections generated by Lose Your Mother, we can hear that same kind of sense of afterlives of slavery, of the impact that slavery has had on the US and on the world in a whole host of work that has emerged today, including, most iconically, and in some ways that I think has been quite tender to some folks who don't want to face that history, projects like the 1619 Project. In this moment, this was still, I feel like, and my memory could be wrong, I feel like this was still a revelation to scholars, the idea that we can connect these things, the idea that there are afterlives of slavery that are having ripple effects in the present in very concrete ways, in ways that we can trace and that we can have structural conversations about. And what also was very new was work around and specific to African women and women of African descent. So only a few years before had Stephanie Camp published Closer to Freedom, her study on enslaved women's resistance practices in the US. That's 2004. Same year, Jennifer Morgan publishes Laboring Women on women's, African women and women African descent's resistance in the British Caribbean. And these are all, in the US context at least, join Deborah Gray White's Aren't I a Woman on Female Slaves in the Antebellum South as the 3 texts on Black women in slavery as far as academic history books. So this is a particular moment. And in this book, in Lose Your Mother joins that, both by being a text that relates Hartman's own journey from the US to Ghana along the slave routes, as well as the interactions that Hartman is having with everything from folks in Accra, in Osu, at Cape Coast Castle, and her own experiences and her own refraction of that with an African-American identity, with African-Americans' long history of engagement with Pan-Africanism, with Ghana, with dreams of some kind of home and some kind of otherwise, of not being the stranger. And the tensions there and the poignancy of that struggle and that encounter, the things that cannot be reconciled, and the new kinds of possibilities that emerge, is something that I think has been rarely replicated in text since. It has been described, I think, in some ways as a neo-slave narrative, but I think that actually does not get to the root of what Lose Your Mother does for us and how we're thinking about the relationship between slavery in the past and that past actually having a very real present and the possibility of other kinds of futures. It's also important to note that in that same sort of corpus of work around Black women scholars, you also have both the Dead Book chapter in Lose Your Mother and another version of it, Venus in 2 Acts, which is published in 2008. And so this is like the kind of world of thought that I got to write into as a graduate student, and was incredibly important as someone who is a historian. And Dr. Fuentes has sort of related some of her own story in trying to write these histories in the face of a profession that has often put up walls around interrogating these kinds of stories in this way, but also as a historian in a department in which I was part of a cohort of scholars of color that were sort of new and unique to that department, and had to, and in many ways, had to navigate our own feelings of estrangement and feeling like strangers, both within a profession, but also in navigating a broader discipline. And I'm incredibly grateful to both my advisor, Ira Berlin, but also mentors like Elsa Barkley Brown and Aileen Bowles and Psyche Williams Forson and Hilary Jones, who could be there and could be representative, and also to Hartman through this text that I was able to kind of explore and think about these broader experiences that the archive can lend us to. I want to do, there's 2 other moments that I think are really, really important in thinking about the ways that Lose Your Mother has had such an impact, certainly on my own work, but I think broadly, and I think it leads right into thinking with Wayward Lives, to be honest. All right, so there are two passages that, as keywords, people know I like keywords, we can think of as The Fugitive and as Fugitive 2. So first, if after a year in Ghana, I could still call myself an African American, it was because my Africa had its source in the commons created by fugitives and rebels, in the courage of suicidal girls aboard slave ships, and in the efforts thwarted and realized of revolutionaries intent upon stopping the clock and instituting a new order, even if it cost them their lives. For me, returning to the source didn't lead to the great courts and to the regalia of kings and queens. The legacy that I chose to claim was articulated in the ongoing struggle to escape, stand down, and defeat slavery in all of its myriad forms. It was the fugitive's legacy. It didn't require me to wait on bended knee for a great emancipator. It wasn't the dream of a White House, even if it was in Harlem, but of a free territory. It was a dream of autonomy rather than nationhood. It was the dream of an elsewhere with all its promises and dangers, where the stateless might at last thrive. So this last chapter, this is part of the Fugitive Dreams, the last chapter, and the entire project is a master text in knitting together the links and the hopes and possibilities of Pan-African dreams, and also the heartbreaks and the impossible things, the things that are impossible to reconcile. But these last sections really are important for how we can crystallize the relationship between the continent and its diaspora, and really maybe get into some of the tense and tender relationships between those who are the fugitives on both sides of the Atlantic, and the ways to think about global class orders of elites, of capitalists, and how we can embrace a different kind of legacy. So what if the legacy that we are embarking on, that we want bequeathed to ourselves, is not one of nationhood, is not one of kings and royals, but is of those who were seen as strangers, who were then discarded, or who were maligned, or who were seen as those who need to be pushed out for a whole host of reasons? What if we reframe kinship? And there's another quote that she has in the text that was something along the lines of kinship required a lie. I'll find it later, I'm sure, as we're in conversation. What if instead of that, the legacy of our Pan-African dreams is actually the legacy of the fugitive, and how might that reshape the kinds of solidarities, to think with solidarities that we're engaged in the present and in the past. Which leads me to my the last sort of the quote from the book that I hope can kind of ground us is, and the key word for me in this is Fugitive 2. And I'm gonna read this because I love it. I feel like it's so much one of the points of the book. And it's one of those that I think, I hope does not get lost in the shuffle of so many of the other heartbreaks in the book. So here we go. In the small clearing made by the ring of houses, 4 girls were playing a game of jump rope. Their mothers and grandmothers had been unable to speak about Golu's past, so the girls spoke for them. 2 girls were at the center of the circle, and the others surrounded them, singing and clapping. Mumbi waited her turn and then jumped into the circle to the girls' delight, singing as she twirled round and round in the center. I stood at the outskirts of the circle, watching. My feet were not moving, but I felt as if I were dancing too. When Mumbi exited the circle, the girls resumed their song. Gwolu is a town of gold. When you enter the circle, you will be protected. You will be safe. The young man standing next to me offered to translate. Sister was the first word out of his mouth. As soon as I heard it, I readied myself for what I was sure would follow. It was the lure, and I waited for him to reel me in. He said something that I couldn't hear because of the girl's song. I shook my head to indicate that I didn't understand what he had said. He moved a few inches closer to me and then shouted in my ear, "The girls are singing about those taken from Golu and sold into slavery in the Americas. They are singing about the diaspora." Here it was, my song, the song of the lost tribe. I closed my eyes and I listened. this song, this jump rope dance that Hartman witnesses and reports back to us and shares with us through this text is a song and a dance that is happening in one of the villages further north that as part of its legacy and its history and its genealogy stood strong against slave raiders. So they are essentially survivors of the slave trade in the African context. And her ability to kind of not miss the games that Black girls play and the history that is told there, not miss the kinds of resistance practices that are part of the everyday experiences of Black girls jumping rope, playing, calling out to their friends, calling out to each other, and that those things happen to be put into words, into song, is so incredibly important because it's a kind of witnessing that is part of seeing the chorus for what it is, seeing it as increase, and seeing it as having the kind of possibility, a fugitive song that might lead us into a different kind of autonomy and a different kind of presence. So thank you so much for this work. Thank you so much for seeing us in all of our senses across all parts of the diaspora, and I'll stop there.
Hey, can everybody hear me? All right, dig it. If at some point I start to trail off, just wave or something, you can talk at me too, okay? Thank y'all for the invitation. I am regularly in, what's up? Yeah, louder? Yeah, good, okay. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, all right? Thank you, Minka, for the invitation. I was so frightened when I sat down to write, but frightened in this good way. Frightened because, Saidiya, you helped make me possible and my writing possible. And I'm very, very thankful for that. I'm nosy, which is why I go into archives. And I'm less of a capital H historian than I am like a historical gossip, because I'm constantly listening for stories and trying to figure out who was doing what, where, how, and all of that. And there's a particular way that I'm trying to engage the archive that's not necessarily about argumentation. There's some aspects of Black life that I refuse to argue with people over. It will not be an intellectual exercise. And so I try to figure out ways to tell stories. Many times these stories will happen over gin if it's spring and summer. If it's fall, then it's probably gonna be cognac. But I would sit in a dimly lit corner. I would sit with friends and I would say, girl, you won't believe what I just read in this letter, right? Or it would be a moment like, I have here on my screen a draft of this short piece that Toni Morrison wrote about a novel that she absolutely loved by Gail Jones called Corregidora. So I'm gonna start with that. Okay. Ursa Corregidora, the last of the line, is legend, phoenix, ghost, sister love. A kind of combination Billie Holiday and Fannie Lou Hamer, poignant, frail, and knee-buckling. She was every wilted gardenia and every plate of butter beans she was lying cooked in a hominy. And I'm going to skip down to this last line. Ursa Corregidora is not possible, neither is Gail Jones, but they exist. Over and over and over as a writer, I keep asking myself about how it is that we write existence, how we write and engage in meaningful ways Black existence. And there's one particular problem that seems to crop up over and over and over and over in the academy. And if you bear with me, I'm just going to read excerpts from 3 different texts. It's maybe 5 or 6 different texts, but I'm distilling them down to 3, okay? I'll begin with Hartman's Venus in 2 Acts. Variously named Harriet, Phoeba, Sarah, Joanna, Rachel, Linda, and Sally, she is found everywhere in the Atlantic world. The barracoon, the hollow of the slave ship, the pest house, the brothel, the cage, the surgeon's laboratory, the prison, the cane field, the kitchen, the master's bedroom turn out to be exactly the same place, and in all of them she is called Venus. Okay. 2008. Let's go to 1987. Let's face it, I'm a marked woman, but not everybody knows my name. Peaches and brown sugar, sapphire and earth mother, auntie, granny, God's holy fool, a Miss Ebony first, or a black woman at the podium. I describe a locus of confounded identities, a meeting ground of investments and privations in the national treasury of rhetorical wealth. My country needs me, and if I were not here, I would have to be invented. Hortense, Jeanette, Spillers, Mama's baby, Papa's maybe. I'm a note, for time's sake, I skipped over Patricia Hill Collins, who in Black Feminist Thought also has a version of that same introduction for her Controlling Images chapter. Let's go to 1975 and 1982, and maybe a few years in between there through Maya Angelou, Trudier Harris, and Mary Helen Washington. Called matriarch, emasculator, hot mama, sometimes sister, pretty baby, auntie, mammy, and girl. Called unwed mother, welfare recipient, and inner city consumer. The Black American woman has had to admit that while nobody knew the trouble she saw, everybody, his brother and his dog, felt qualified to explain her even to herself. So, it's still early enough in the day. I'm going to be, halfway polite about some of my remarks regarding academic writing and engagement with Black women and girls. But I will say this. It is deeply frustrating to encounter scholars who generate concepts as if they are writing life into bodies and people who have been here and have been speaking. When Barbara Christian published The Race for Theory, right, she reminded us of that. And I'm reminded of this every time I sit with your work, Saidiya. I'm reminded of the fact that Black folk been here, Black women been here, Black girls been here, Black femmes, non-binary. They have been the occasion, not simply for capture, but they have been and remain the occasion for possibility over and over and over. And so as I sit with Wayward Lives, and I sit with all of Saidiya's writings, I'm constantly trying to figure out, how does one communicate breath on a page? How does one reset or reestablish or even just figure out a whole new context for engaging the kind of academic language and the theories that we utilize to make claims about Black life? How do we reinvent story? So I'm gonna try to keep it very practical. When I sit with an idea or I sit with language, I have to study Saidiya's work. I have to consider that under the official is life. So if we go back to those 3 passages, part of what frustrates me about their existence is that we as academics at times continue to perform intellectual exercises on the page that reinscribe that very dynamic, which is to say, we have a moment of spectacular refusal, and we say we need to do things differently. But then we kind of trail off, and then we kind of settle into those established ways of writing about Black resistance and or existence. And so it's really wonderful for me as a writer and as a thinker to have that ongoing reminder, right? And the reminder, the reminder can make the task feel so daunting, right? It can make you feel as though there isn't much else to say because the resistance can be so great. Our colleagues resist who it is that we try to make known in our work, right? But that's their problem. This is why we have books like Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. It's the ongoing reminder. It's the book that you open, you sit with a sentence, and I think about in Pieces I Am, was it Sonia Sanchez maybe, who talked about sitting with Sula, and she'll like sit in the corner and throw that book across the room, and then go over and pick it up and start laughing, right? Wayward Lives is an act of haunting over and over and over, right? And so whenever I sit with this book, I'm thinking about folks like Zora Neale Hurston, who in the 40s wrote this letter to Du Bois where she was trying to get support to construct a cemetery for the illustrious Negro dead, right? She wanted 100 acres in Florida, right, where a shelter, a building, a structure could be designed and placed there. It would be designed by visual artists, right? Zora imagined a world, and it had to be 100 acres and in Florida because it's still Florida and black folks need to see who's coming, right? She imagined this environment wherein we could gather, create, play with ourselves and the dead. We could be there together celebrating life, conjuring otherwise ways of being. In that letter, Zora also thought about the relationship between the plants on that property and insects. There's an expanded willingness to engage the multiple forms of life, the ecosystems that help make us possible. And so again, when I sit with Hartman's work, I consider, damn, how is it that I've been hiding from the very kind of scholar I've been wanting to be? In 2015, it's my second year on the tenure track. I was teaching Black Studies. And in the 6-day period, I was hospitalized 3 times. The 3rd time, I was rushed into surgery. My parents had to fly in to take care of me. That was the year that I say Black excellence damn near killed me, because I had taken on protocols of representation and productivity that were actively destroying my life. I was hospitalized a week after I found out I'd gotten a Fulbright to go to the Czech Republic and teach Black Studies. And so when I was in physical therapy, the whole goal was for me to get a clean bill of health so that I could move to Prague. When I moved, I took maybe 4 or 5 books with me. Lose Your Mother was the first book that I packed, right? And when I got to Prague, one of the things that I wanted to do, I said, okay, self, you're gonna scale it back. You know, you're a Negro of a certain age. You've just gotten out the hospital. You need to keep it together. Right? One way that I kept it together was by studying. And I started with Venus in Two Acts. Saidiya, I read that essay more times that year than I have at any other point in my life. And it's recursive outlines, it's trying to figure out, I thought back to grad school when Mariam Thagard helped a group of students understand how she sat with Hortense Spillers' essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. And she said, sometimes I just try to take a paragraph and distill it into a thought, right? And then I try to figure out if I understand the structure of the essay. And so I kept coming back to Venus in Two Acts over and over and over. And in reading that, I had to go to Lose Your Mother too. Because even now I teach it as a triptych, right? There's the Dead Book, there's Venus in Two Acts, and then there's Dead Book Revisited. And when I'm talking with my students about this work, I'm trying to get them to understand how we get to a book like Wayward Lives, right? We haven't even had the real kickback with Scenes of Subjection yet, right? With them, I'm like, y'all, you don't always have to know. Sometimes it's about the practice. And when you have scholars who are committed to engaging in a practice and revising actively ideas over and over and over, that is what's going to help make you a better thinker and somebody who is seriously showing through their work their commitment to Black life. And so to move from Dead Book to Venus in Two Acts and Dead Book Revisited and just study sentences, I tell them, please do not come in here acting as if you know it all, because you don't, but just study the kinds of problems that are being taken up and note how Hartman moves and revises actively over and over and over. We spend significant time on that so that by the time we get to Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, it's not just a question of reading a book that I'm thoroughly convinced a number of people believe they understand because of the deceptive accessibility of the prose. But I'm constantly thinking under that, like, Saidiya, there is this thing that is happening. Bear with me. I'm going to read some of your words to you, okay? All right. The Wayward were guilty of a manner of living and existing deemed dangerous and were a risk to the public good. Formally, they were not juvenile delinquents because, quote, juvenile includes the commission, or sorry, delinquency includes the commission of an act which, if committed by an adult, would be adjudged a crime and punished as such, unquote. In contrast, the provisions of the Wayward Minors Act held the definition of a wayward minor includes only non-criminal acts, but which indicate the imminence of future criminality. All those labels that have been assigned to Black women and to Black girls haunt me as I try to write about, not even try, just actively write about and dream up an approach to narrating the actions of Black girls who orchestrated, I'm convinced, their strategic erasure, right? Erasure from a scandal that was about other people's fantasies being lived out upon their bodies, right? So when I think about this girl named Juanita, who during World War I is noted by the FBI as having worked for this Dutchman who moved to Washington, D.C., claiming to be an anthropologist so that he can gain access to Black school children, primarily girls. I consider how the FBI, knowing what this man did not document the names of the 5,000 plus school children this man had access to. Okay? I have over 1,000 pages of archival material related to this scandal, and Black girls who might have been involved show up in less than 10 pages. And so when I have a paragraph where an FBI agent talks about Juanita as being a runner, right? This kind of recruiter for a Dutch man who was taking Black girls to the townhouse or to the boarding house that he was renting and staying in. I try to read against the grain, right? I try in a wayward fashion to ask after Juanita. Because to me, while the FBI calls her a runner as a way to pathologize what they perceive as her behavior, I'm thinking about what a runner communicates in terms of understanding the geography of a place. In terms of having a network of social relationships that are deeply meaningful, right? Over and over and over, I'm reminded that this work has been done. And over, I have to tell myself, because my default setting is to write like the scholar I was trained to be. I have to remind myself that other methods are possible. They're right here with us. Okay. All right, bear with me, I'm almost done. I have one more thing. So Saidiya, thank you. Thank you for sitting with the difficulties of the academy. Thank you for forging through everyone else's limited imaginations. Thank you for assembly. Right? Thank you for this beautiful and capacious deviance that we have to celebrate, because Black life is certainly that. Thank you for reminding us that at times, even as we claim to talk about life, we measure life in part by the verbs that we associate with one's existence. And it doesn't matter if it's 1 or 2 verbs or 11, right? You stay there with us and you let those verbs determine the world, right? And you make it okay for a lot of us who struggle with this shit over and over and over to inhabit those worlds and build them out, right? When Zora Neale Hurston was in New Orleans in 1929, she wrote a letter to Franz Boas. That letter for me is important because there's a small moment where she acknowledges or says to him, I think I've avoided the Moen's handicap. She's referencing the scandal that happened in Washington, D.C. That's the center of obscene material. That moment is important to me because at the time, in fall of 1918, Hurston was preparing to go to Howard University and working in a club called the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C. This was a hub of intellectual activity or alleged intellectual activity by a whole host of white men, right? So she likely came into contact with this Dutchman. Just like when she would visit her friend Georgia Douglas Johnson, her friend and mentor, the poet and playwright, who lived a 4-minute walk away, or if you take very, very hard, long drags of a cigarette, half a cigarette away, right, from the very townhouse where Moen was plotting and scheming. Hurston held on, right, held on to that moment in 1918, such that when she did her anthropological work in New Orleans, she thought about it ethically. That's important to me as a would-be historian, primarily because decades after that scandal in the 1980s, when David Levering Lewis was interviewing William Montague Cobb, the Dutchman's casebook emerges. William Montague Cobb pulls out a copy of it, and in reading a transcript of that interview, you get to see these two very learned black male scholars sit and kind of playfully discuss the bodies of black girls that are in this book. And so it's one thing to sit with as a scholar the disgust that you feel when you read that kind of exchange. And it's another thing to find a home and a letter written from Zora Neale Hurston to Franz Boas. A letter that will always conceal far more than Hurston would ever reveal. Because she, like these black girls, knew something about a world that didn't see them. And they acted in ways that allowed them to have a life that we're now fighting now to get access to. Thank you, Saidiya.
I think we're going to be joined now by Asma Naeem. I'm so emotional.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? I'm Asma Naeem. I just want to first thank what has been very moving morning for me, sitting here on a campus that I attended as an undergrad 30 years ago. I was telling Dr. Hartman. And to see the transformations that are occurring right before our eyes in these bold leaders who are making a new future for all of us. So I want to first thank all three speakers, Dr. Fuentes, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Carter. Thank you very much. And of course, I want to also just take a moment to thank the beautiful spirit that is here with us, Dr. Saidiya Hartman, who has been a figure in my life in surprising and unsurprising ways. From the time that I was a criminal lawyer in New York, trying to find my way through a criminal justice system, that I was trying to, how can I say this? Create a better world. And it was your words that started to help me understand that the ways in which our current society operates and the ways in which the current language that we have isn't enough. And so with that, I want to turn to something that I found extremely beautiful in all three of your papers, and I'm hoping that you can talk about, which is the ways in which there is an incapacity. There isn't a sense of enough in the disciplines in which you work. and the ways in which language, and I think of Fred Moten, who talks about the ways in which rap and hip hop music show again the efforts by Black people to destroy the English language. And I think about all three of you in the ways in which you talk about trying to create a new model, because it isn't enough what we have in front of us as academics. And I'm wondering if you can all share some thoughts about that.
I think, can you hear me? You can, okay. I think I'll venture to try and speak to this really provocative question. I think for me specifically, I want to say this because we're all teachers, and we confront students, or they confront us, that there's nothing to say, that there's no archive, that there's no voices. And I want to refute that. It's not that there's not enough, because I think that the voices of colonial authorities and slave owners, and that is robust, right? I think what I learned from Saidiya's work is that the tools that I had in my arsenal were not enough when I sort of first ventured into this work. The tools of the historical guilt actually refused to acknowledge the people that I did find, and ways to speak about them. So I think the model that I took from Saidiya's work was really to really invent our own tools. And maybe that speaks to the idea of a kind of way to destroy the tools of language that you referred to, about music, about rules, about engagement, that we need to sort of make up our own way. Sorry, there's movement. So I'll stop, but thank you for the question.
Yeah, please.
Destroy the tools of language? Thank you. Yes, 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 yes. Destroy actively. If Hortense Spillers wrote, "Sticks and bricks might break bones, but words will most certainly kill us." If that sentiment haunts various modes of academic writing, again, revealing the limits of particular kinds of modes of thought around Black life, then Saidiya plays with language in this really beautiful and poetic way that reminds us of the ways that Black folks in boredom exceed what the Academy could possibly imagine, right? And there's something to me so very vibrant about a scholar who can help you sit with a word and try to understand how a word reveals a relation and also a possibility, right? So whereas the Academy, or some of us, as academics, writers, creatives, will kind of sit with the problem of a particular antagonism in our writing, it's also worthwhile, right, to remind ourselves that language can do other things. Sometimes I think about how scholar Kevin Kwashi, I describe him as the kind of person who can hang out in a phrase for a day and just sit in awe of how one scopes an idea. Mm-hmm. And Saidiya gives us all of these scenes that allow us to do that, right? Like the minor conceptually undermines so much of how I thought I was supposed to write as a graduate student. In the minor, you can see yourself, you can see your people, the dreams are there, all of this stuff is wrapped up in the minor. And when I ask myself a question of scale, I'm like, how does one term function so ebulliently? And why does that scare me so much? And so over and over and over, it's, well, what happens when you just sit back and kind of sculpt the scene? When you let one movement guide how you try to narrate a world. And so for me, you know, in a very kind of practical methods way, hang out with a word and see how it works on you. Hang out with a phrase, hang out with a sentence, and see what world it is reproducing and or making possible.
I think that I don't know that there's much I can add to these last two, because I feel like I'm situated in some ways between. Like I am, and other scholars, not just myself, but there's a generation of us that are recipients of the kind of witnessing that Hartman's trilogy offers us, the tools. So like being able to come into the world, the scholarly world, after Marisa, who comes in after Hartman, who have already sort of, you know, done the kind of bloodletting that is necessary to do this work, is, I guess, sort of how I'm thinking about, like, what is the scaffolding needed in order to reshape how we think about the world, the language that we use, the histories that we tell, and what scaffolding then comes next, right? Like, what are we setting out now that can, even if shaky, lend to these kinds of rearrangements, whether it's a minor key, whether it's a chorus line, whether it's moving along the bias grain. I guess I am thinking about it in a kind of material 3D fashion. Like I'm seeing the answer to your question in some ways more than I'm able to articulate it, because I think it requires a vision of what has come before, but also a kind of audacity. And I do feel like I see that in the generation of Black feminist thought that is operating now, a kind of audacity to like really reconceive the terms of engagement. And I don't know that certainly does not exist, I think, without these works and without all three of them together. And I think even we see them in relationship, we can see them in relationship to each other, like as building into a practice and pushing that practice further and further, not resting in, and not that there was anything to rest in scenes, because scenes is magnificent, but not stopping there and saying, no, there's somewhere else we can push, and there's somewhere else that we can have this conversation. There's another moment in a later period. There's another place across the Atlantic to kind of have this conversation and think with it. So I think that's what I'm saying. So both like thinking of like breaking tools and being in community with the minor figure, but also that all of these things are happening at the same time, and some of these things had to come before in order to get to an imagining of the next thing. And how do we also tap into that, right? That kind of imagining of a futurity that, you know, I'm not sure that everybody could even conceive as possible, right? Like there's a way that Blackness, Black studies, Black history, the slave, all of this ends up in this kind of stasis for some scholars, for the field. And I think that this work, its trajectory, you know, they're almost give or take a decade between each. I think that proves that that's not the case, and that has to always be troubled and even if it's more questions than answers, it has to always be troubled and unseated if possible. And even now, like the work that's happening now in art and with the loophole of retreat, and there's so many, like there's an even further pushing, like Hartman's Oeuvre keeps pushing and keeps pushing us to like think that there are other ways, other languages in order to think with the minor subject or the girl on the ship. So.
Thank you. Those were wonderful, and I want to say what I will be getting to in a moment is whether Dr. Hartman's three works, whether we can actually still use the framework of a trilogy, if this is something that exceeds that kind of bound sense that a trilogy suggests in terms of a futurity. I also am thinking of Sylvia Wynter, the Jamaican philosopher's words about a new humanness and how she was trying to imagine a new humanness in many of the ways that Dr. Hartman was trying to imagine a new archive in a way, a retelling, and how the current forms of knowledge couldn't hold what is ahead of us, and what you were using as words to shape. So I want to get to the question of the gaps, which came up, I think, in so many interesting ways. First, for Dr. Fuentes, talking about the ways in which she said that there were critics who were saying that they couldn't wait for structuralism to return to the field, which I thought was an interesting, really interesting academic response, and something that talks about the level of conservative voice in the field that exists to this day. And I also want to talk about the ways in which you so beautifully, Dr. Johnson, talk about the unspoken histories, the tracings of the afterlives that you saw awakened in you, and the fugitive's legacy, which seems almost like an oxymoron, the ways in which somebody who is unmoored and fleeing can actually think about what is ahead and unknown. And then I think about Dr. Carter's words about refusing to argue over the refusing, I should say, to stick to the formal structure of an historian, and being a historical gossip, as you say, figuring out a way to tell stories. Not everyone knows my name. Creating breath on a page, and how do we reinvent the story, the spectacular refusal, and even the kind of ontological shivers of a ghostly presence, as you said, a haunting over and over and over again. So I just spoke for a very long time trying to connect all three of your beautiful papers with Dr. Hartman's incredible body of knowledge. But if you can all talk about the gaps, and then I think we'll then turn to the question of the trilogy, if that sounds good.
That's wonderful.
I'll respond to this provocation, gaps. I was also writing furiously when both of you were speaking about words, rearrangements, audacity, refusal, insistence. I mean, I think I was reflecting on a lot when I was writing this, but there was a refusal of the language in scenes. There was a refusal of sitting with and thinking through layers and layers and layers of meaning. And that was striking to me. It was revealing, I think, of the way when I came into the field, historians did not tend to read outside their field. And so the circulation of just particular kinds of historical writing and narrative, that was traditional. And that's how it's done. I think so gaps also represents to me method, right? Like by leaning into the gaps, both the gap of not having and having to invent method to really attend to Black subjects, but also the gaps in I think taking up this work. I think that that we all know, and sitting here and talking about it, that this work it's part of our DNA now. It's part of our thinking. We cannot think without these works, and yet there's still gaps, I would say, in the way that people write, like that you have to actually willfully ignore these texts to continue to write in a particular historical tradition. So I think that we are still sitting with some really profound gaps that our methods actually need to continue to interrogate and refuse and lean into.
Yeah, I can definitely jump in there, and I just want to say that what Dr. Fuentes is relating is not disappeared in any kind of way. That is still, I think, the placement for many ways of thinking about history and thinking about this history in particular. There's a resistance still to, there's a continued ignoring of the gaps and a continued resistance to the kinds of provocations and realities that are related in dispossessed lives that are brought to the fore in scenes, and so it's still about inventing a method. I love that. I think I can bring this into thinking about the fugitive's legacy, and the resonance of that for me has been a challenge to continue to seek that out also in the actions of enslaved and free people of African descent, and to continue to not be complacent with what is present before me in the archive as it stands, right? That there is a fantastic otherwise somewhere just past, even if it is not being articulated, and even if I have yet the words, if many of us have yet the words to describe it, but the root to that is it's my children. But the root to that is through a solidarity with the common. It's a solidarity with the minor figure. And it's a practice of doing that over and over and over again. Again, like against our training, against the things that we're told about what we should assume and know about the continent, about Africans, about ourselves, about blackness, all of that. It's a continued pushing against and past that. And so for me, that the fugitive's legacy is a method and a practice. And it begins with Black girls. Like, I just love this scene. It begins with Black girls jumping rope. And like, what if we always took it that seriously? So that's where that's some of the things I'm thinking. And they don't, last thing I'll say is like, they don't appear, except they are everywhere. And that's what's amazing about Wayward Lives, is because like you end Lose Your Mother with these Black girls jumping rope across an ocean of where you presume from popular memory of Black life, Black girls jumping rope might be. And then you end up in Philly and in New York and in Boston and all these other places, in Florida with Zora. Like, you end up in an entire volume of these particular moments, cracked out of documents that they appear as only splayed on a couch, right? Which is like that minor figure a chapter and section. And that, I don't think you get there without the fugitive as a method. And I also don't think you get there without also traveling through these other bloody parts. Like, they don't exist outside of each other. And I think that's other important challenge of Lose Your Mother. Like, there is like it can't be solely nationhood and glory. That the practice of engaging and trafficking in glory is also a transaction that loses something along the way. You still lose your mother along the way. It has to be something else. And that something else is what I think, like she challenged, this text especially, but that Hartman's work broadly challenges us to push into. And that's to say that we're all doing it well, or right, or like that we have the answers, but that there is something else there, is something very different from many of our training in the humanities as academics, but definitely as historians. That's something that increasingly is sort of at least accepted as a practice, but for a long time and is always like right there under the surface, there is the presumption is like, no, that's not what we do. That's not real. And challenging that bulwark of the profession is very, sometimes can be very dangerous work. It can be very dangerous work. And I think that, we live in a wonderful moment where this work is celebrated and has risen to the top of a world of celebration and institution, and appears in institutions that they would not have imagined it would be there, but that's always right there under the surface. And so that also is in some ways the fugitive's legacy, knowing that, all right, today we celebrate because tomorrow, because this may never happen again. This is all ephemeral, and tomorrow it may be, off with their heads. So we do what we can in the breaks, I think.
Y'all, whenever my friend talks in public, I'm like, talk your shit, JMJ. Every time. There is, no, thank you. Thank you to both of you for that. And thank you for this question, this prompting around gaps. When I hear gaps, I think about the ways that scholars rhetorically use, it'll be in a conference abstract or a conference paper abstract or some article where there's been a gap in the literature. And so when I'm talking with my grad students, I'm like, yeah, y'all, so instead of like making a kind of descriptive claim about the gap, could we first begin with how your respective disciplines orchestrate a perceived erasure of a particular group of people? Right? So I'm like, let's do a top-down situation. Like, we want to do top-down so much, so let's start with that. How the disciplines strategically orchestrate at times. The erasure of particular groups, subject positions, the whole nine. And I'm like, with that, how about we sit with a piece of data or a text or a movement, right? Or a story, or even a scene in a work of literature. I'm obsessed with Tony K. Bambara's My Man Bovan. There's this moment where Miss Hazel, who's the main character in the short story, is dancing with Bovan. They're like slow dancing, and I always imagine them like cheek to cheek, torso to torso. It's just like this slow rocking embrace. And Miss Hazel's children, who are newly radicalized, like would-be Black Power radicals, are reprimanding their mother in the kitchen because they disapprove of her dancing with Bovan in public. They want her to be with somebody who is more in line with their revolutionary aims. And I'm like, so you mean to tell me that a slow dance is gonna undermine your entire political project? Right? But in that moment, it's in part about, these children wanting to possess their mother's body in a particular kind of way, to orchestrate how she moves in the world. And I'm like, oh, but to begin with that slow dance and have Miss Hazel, I'm gonna put some respect on her name, to have Miss Hazel's decision to slow dance with this man orchestrate how you write about Black women's agency, right? Mm-hmm. I'm very curious about how that could look or feel, how we might think or even perform or visualize that into existence. In part because when I'm thinking about this body of work, these are books within books. Right? It's not just scenes, it's not just Lose Your Mother, it's not just Wayward Lives, it's not even just, the essays or the conversations. You could build multiple books just based on sections of these various projects. Mm-hmm. And some of them will hit the same and many of them will hit radically different, right? You could build, I'm fashioning myself an artist bookmaker at this point, but there is something to be said for how you could build an entire book just based on the questions that Saidiya Hartman has asked across her projects. And you could try to answer those questions by sitting with the visual work, the music, the performances that are also a part of this chorus. Like Loophole of Retreat, y'all come on, right? It's that kind of engagement. It's that kind of thinking beyond the page. It's method, it's form, it's not simply the content, but it is how it is that we engage. And so to be asked to read more expansively, to be asked to think across context, to be asked to sit with, yes, the minor figure, and, in Carrie Mae Weems's From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried, this is one photograph, the young Black woman laying back, and the caption with it says playmate of the patriarch. Mm-hmm. And so there's something happening visually that I can only access as a viewer because of Hartman's writing, right? And so when I listen to Carrie Mae Weems talk about her work and she says, well, I begin with a question, what do we do with women we cannot see? My entire thought process shifts, right? When I lead not with what a gap allegedly tells us about the people who are left out, but instead I lead with a question of the gap as what is it that we have orchestrated, or what is it that Black girls have orchestrated? It hits different. And so I'll simply end by, invoking my mother's mother, Frances. She does not let me call her grandma. I tried in 1990. It did not go well. And so she is my mother's mother. Last year I was sitting with her and I said, Frances, will you tell me stories about when you were growing up? And she looked at me and said, I'm still growing. So I went to sleep. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carter. I see that we are running out of time. I just want to say that if you all want to start a conversation among yourselves and with the speakers after this convening, this morning session, I should say, of this convening, about the ways in which the trilogy holds as a concept for Dr. Hartman's work, I welcome you to do that. I will also say that Loophole, the retreat that was mentioned here several times, illustrates the canon that is being shaped around Dr. Hartman's work and how that canon is multidisciplinary and engages in kinds of creativity and language and art making that none of us have ever imagined. And in that vein, I would say that please do come to the Baltimore Museum of Art to see the legacies of the Great Migration, a movement in every direction co-curated by Ryan Dennis and Jessica Bell Brown, that Dr. Hartman has been a thought partner for in many important ways, because that work is still being done right in front of us and right nearby. I want to take this moment to thank all of the speakers and thank you for attending. And Dr. Hartman, we are in your debt.